Can we rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
Recording has started.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I appreciate everyone making the time to be here this evening. As you know, I called for this joint meeting to provide an update to all of our town bodies and the residents of our community on the status of the fill pile and the affiliated sites, and to provide an overview of the work that has been done and where we are headed. So you as elected officials and all of our residents can have a better understanding of what we are facing. I know this entire scandal has been so incredibly frustrating for our community, and that the town's residents' trust in their government was severely damaged. But I have done my best over the last 2 years to work to rebuild that trust. Litigation is in progress on many fronts. Former town employees are facing multiple felony counts, and I know that you join me and our residents in hoping that anyone who is convicted of these will be brought to justice. The time and expense devoted to this will be ongoing for a very long time, and the full extent to which we do not know yet. I want our residents to know that we are working to clean this up. We have licensed environmental professionals guiding us through this process, and part of tonight's presentation will illustrate the complexity of the process we are following. While it's been 2 years, we are making significant progress. The town's environmental attorney, Mike Miller of Wigan and Dana, has joined me tonight to assist in giving this presentation and will be answering questions. Mike has been directly involved in negotiating the regulatory agencies and the consent orders that you will learn more about this evening. I would also like to take a moment to give special thanks to our town's Chief Administrative Officer for coordinating these efforts on behalf of our town. Tom Bremer has worked with our current employees in assisting in this cleanup. This is a huge time commitment on a weekly basis, managing dozens of locations, multiple licensed environmental professionals, different regulatory agencies, and multiple town departments, including DPW, Conservation, Park and Rec, and our health department. It's a tremendous amount of coordination, oversight, and tracking. So I just wanted to thank Tom Bremer for his efforts for the last 2 years, and unfortunately, we'll be doing this for quite a while. I would like to start us off and ask that all of our elected officials please hold your questions until the end. The presentation will be posted on our town website and will also be included in the newsletter. I ask that when we're finished with the presentation, if as we're going through the presentation and a question pops in to your head that you want to ask, if you could just put your name into the chat area, and then when we're finished with the presentation, we will call you in the order in which you put your name in the chat. So we're going to start off with the sites for today's discussion. The fill pile, which we are familiar with, and then the Julian fill sites, Penfield Pavilion, and the Water Pollution Control Authority. So the background, the Julian Enterprises was awarded the bid to operate the fill pile from 2013 to 2016, with a focus on reducing the size of the fill pile. In 2016, neighbors reported heavy truck traffic and that the size of the fill pile had increased. I recall that actually I was a state representative for that district at the time, and there were multiple meetings the town held in response to these complaints. In November of 2016, Logical Environmental Solutions was hired to perform tests on the fill pile and identified PCBs and other contaminants in loads that were accepted by Julian Enterprises. The fill pile was shut down in light of Logical's findings, and in 2018, a berm was constructed by the town without DEP required permits. And I'm going to now hand this over to Mike Miller to go through the next several slides.
Thank you, First Selectwoman. Mike Miller, I'm a partner with Wigan & Dana. I've been practicing environmental law and health and safety law. I'm a former environmental engineer, just by way of background. For the past 2+ years, I've been working with the town to negotiate and coordinate regulatory issues with US EPA on the federal level and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, or DEEP, you'll hear that acronym, and various divisions and bureaus within that agency. Today I'm going to give you some of the regulatory overlay related to the fill pile, or what's also referred to as the reclamation yard. And then we'll call the other sites that are within the town's boundaries the Julian fill sites. I think it's important for those who aren't familiar with the history of this matter that, during the time period Julian operated and controlled the fill pile, materials that were inappropriate and contained hazardous materials, hazardous substances were accepted and processed. And then that material was sent to other locations off-site, off of that property. So the town has been, pursuant to DEP and EPA oversight, sampling and investigating and performing remediation at those sites that received the Julian fill, and creating a plan to remedy or close the fill pile as it is today. And when I say close, that's a regulatory term. We'll get into the different statutes and regulations that govern the operation and closure of the fill pile. In short shrift and basic summary, the fill pile is regulated as a solid waste disposal area because of the presence of polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. And as an environmental lawyer, I apologize for all the acronyms you're going to hear tonight. You're just going to have to bear with us. PCBs are regulated federally under the Federal Toxic Substances Control Act. And when the PCB concentrations were identified, as First Selectwoman Kupchak reported in the last slide, by Logical, the fill pile became regulated at the federal level and the DEEP level. So that complexity is further conflated with EPA Region 1 up in Boston, their PCB unit, and now you have regulation by DEP up in Hartford, its PCB unit. PCBs were not the only contaminant of concern identified at the fill pile, so DEEP's Remediation Division has also been involved. And as I indicated, the fill pile, because of the contamination there, is regulated as a solid waste disposal area, so the Solid Waste Division at DEEP is also involved. Among these different bureaus and divisions at DEEP, there have been enforcement actions brought and issued by DEEP against the town by way of what are called notices of violation. There are 3 of those identified in the second bullet on this slide. The first relates to the PCB concentrations that were identified at the fill pile. The second relates to altering the solid waste disposal area, that means the fill pile itself, without the required permits. That NOV, or notice of violation, related to the construction of the berm without obtaining the required permit to do so. And then the last NOV that was issued related to the fill pile is the depositing of dredge spoils from another site without a permit at the fill pile. So ever since these NOVs were issued and since I became involved with the town under First Selectwoman Kupchik, sought out qualified and reputable licensed environmental professionals to help with the technical substance of advising the investigation and remediation of these sites, the fill pile and the Julian fill sites. Weston and Sampson was identified and awarded the work to coordinate with DEEP and EPA on the fill pile matter. Weston and Sampson has coordinated with EPA Region 1 staff and DEEP on a monthly basis since they were engaged early in 2020. They have substantially completed investigation of the entire fill pile. And when I say that, they've driven pilings down to groundwater at the fill pile across the entirety of the berm and within the processing area at the fill pile. They've taken samples and then analyzed samples of soil and debris. They've taken groundwater. All of this information was the subject of review and concurrence by both EPA and DEEP. So there was substantial back and forth with Weston Sampson, myself, town administration, and both EPA and DEEP to devise these sampling plans even before the work was performed. There have been 2 iterations of sampling at the fill pile since the NOVs were issued. They resulted in quite comprehensive investigation reports that are available on the town's website. The first of which was reported in the summer of 2020 and presented to EPA and DEEP. And then later, due to the fact that additional sampling and what's called delineation of the fill pile was required by regulators, Weston and Sampson went back out early part of 2021 and developed a second kind of a data gap analysis and reported its findings in that report issued in the spring of 21. So that comprehensive set of data together is used to design a remedy to, as I indicated, close the fill pile. And when I say close, it means that the town is required to comply with that Federal Toxic Substance Control Act that I referenced before, the Connecticut Remediation Standard Regulations, and the Connecticut Solid Waste statutes and regulations that require permits and closure mechanisms for solid waste disposal areas. This has been a complicated effort, a very complex undertaking, and since developing that volume of data that I referenced, remedial alternatives have been presented to DEEP and EPA, which are now under consideration. Jackie, you can move to the next slide. It's not as simple as selecting a remedy and moving forward with you know, in your own discretion, for example. The town is subject to obtaining concurrence by EPA and DEEP. Regulatory approvals and permits will be required to do the work to close out the fill pile. And of course, we're all here today to explain a situation whereby a past administration didn't obtain the required permits necessary to close the fill pile itself. So under First Selectwoman Kupchik's administration, it's very important that we have full concurrence and approval by both DEEP and EPA to move forward with any remedy. I can't tell you today what the remedy will look like. I can't tell you today with any certainty what DEEP and EPA will approve. However, in concept, and there's precedent across the state, it's expected that there will be some excavation of materials, likely some capping, and some ongoing groundwater and other monitoring going forward. So even when the fill pile is closed, there will be some work to be done to ensure that it's safe and remains safe. Just one other point on that slide. It's really important, and since First Selectwoman Kupchik came into office, we met with DEEP and EPA leadership. The transparency of selection of a remedy is of paramount importance. So Brenda has indicated she wants to have kind of a town hall meeting. I don't know what you want to call it, but where Weston and Sampson presents the remedy once it's approved by DEEP and EPA. for the residents of the town to weigh in, provide comment, feedback on that. But again, not there yet. We don't have insight from the regulators as to what the remedy will be. Okay, so we've talked about the fill pile itself, and now on to those Julian fill sites where the Julian fill material was removed from the fill pile and taken to sites within the town. These sites have been identified by way of town health department staff evaluating records that are available to the town, interviews with DPW staff, and in fact, some residents came forth and gave some information at the time that the investigation was undertaken. So all of that together was used to develop a list of Julian fill sites. Some of these sites have multiple locations where Julian fill was used, and so we struggled with how we, meaning the town and DEEP and EPA together, struggled with how do you address such a complicated network of sites where Julian fill may have been used, but the volume of the Julian fill and the use of the Julian fill isn't always certain. Since May or June of 2020, all the way through October of that year, along with Tom Bremer, I negotiated with DEEP and EPA a consent order that sets the ground rules for these sites. We worked with the Bureau Chiefs of the Water and Remediation Divisions, the Solid Waste Division heads, and got input from EPA. And in my experience and anecdotally from knowing and hearing from DEEP leadership, this is a very complicated consent order, perhaps one of the most comprehensive because it addresses so many sites across the town. Again, because the fill pile is regulated under the federal rules and under the solid waste and the remediation rules, those ancillary Julian fill sites likewise needed to be evaluated to determine what jurisdiction they were governed by and what regulations and statutes governed. So the town designated and identified a reputable firm, Ty & Bond, as the licensed environmental professional. They're actually written into the consent order as the firm that the town selected and that was approved by DEEP to investigate these locations where the placement of Julian fill was reported and has been confirmed. And I'll get into the ground rules about what that means, but in essence, the consent order says, okay, we now know we have a set of sites and locations. We're going to give you, town, 2 years to sample and figure out what's going on at those sites, 3 years to determine how to remediate them, and then within 5 years of signing the consent order in October 2020, we expect you to remediate everything. So that's the timeline that was set forth in the consent order, appreciating how complicated and complex this issue has been. And I think that's important for everybody to understand where we are today, January of 2022, as contrasted with the ground rules that are set forth in the consent order. Remediation and efforts are not approved by DEEP. This is more or less a self-executing consent order. So licensed environmental professionals are bound by certain standards and guidelines as a professional body, and DEEP delegates its authority to licensed environmental professionals to perform site investigation and cleanup, and this consent order is no different. So LEPs, and for instance, Ty & Bond, who's been engaged by the town, will certify and stamp their approval that remediation of these sites has been completed. So I'll try to go through this in a simple format. This is really a decision tree that we essentially go through and that Ty & Bond goes through for each and every of the Julian fill sites, right? I'm going to go through the first, or on the right-hand side, and starting from the top, town identification of Julian fill sites. That's the list that I was referring to that was developed by way of Department of Public Health, Department of Health staff, and DPW interviews. So if you start with those lists of sites, then you test the Julian fill sites, right? So Ty & Bond develops a a set of standards and criteria to evaluate the Julian fill. With that, though, there's a lot of research that goes into these sites, right? So Ty and Bond is trying to figure out where the Julian fill was placed, the scope of the Julian fill placement, when it was placed, trying to recreate the past so they can understand and focus the town's efforts in these areas. There are a lot of sites. And there's concurrence by DEEP and EPA to determine what sampling by Ty and Bond is adequate and sufficient to investigate these sites. And DEEP and EPA have confirmed that the approach is acceptable, and in some instances they've provided guidance to Ty and Bond saying, we think it would be prudent for you to do additional sampling, which the town is undertaking. All right, so you get through the research and you get through the testing, and now you have to look at the data. Ty and Bond evaluates the data and advises the town. If no contamination has been found, so we're looking to the right of the decision tree, Ty and Bond essentially makes a clean fill determination, quote unquote clean fill, and that's a regulatory term defined in the solid waste rules. If that's been confirmed by the sampling that the Julian fill or the fill that was used and investigated does not require remediation, it's a clean fill, then Ty and Bond issues an investigation report, and there's no remediation required by the consent order for that site. As contrasted with on the left side, if Julian fill contamination is identified in the area that's been sampled, then Ty and Bond goes through those actions that I highlighted before in the consent order. They develop a remedial action plan by the LEP, by Ty and Bond, and they submit the draft to DEEP. They complete the remediation in accordance with these set remediation standard regulations. They confirm that the remediation that they complete, and when I say Ty and Bond's completing the remediation, Ty and Bond themselves are not going out with shovels and excavators. They're overseeing town contractors who have gone to bid and got competitive pricing. So they're overseeing this work. But Ty and Bond does go and take samples of the limits of excavation and remediation to confirm that anything that is Julian fill that is contaminated has been removed. And then they submit what's called a RAR, or RAR, it's a Remediation Action Report, that confirms to DEEP, and this is stamped by the licensed environmental professional, that the Julian fill that was investigated, identified to be contaminated, has been removed and remediated in accordance with the consent order. So I'm sure there will be questions about this at a later date, but I think, or a later time, but I think my portion is done for now.
Thanks, Mike. So as you can see here in this slide, what Mike was referring to and what we've talked about over the last 2 years, and I have included numerous times in my newsletter and have shared with town bodies that we knew there was a lot of sites, and the town has worked expeditiously to investigate and remediate a lot of our sites since the consent order was filed with the state. So the green sites are remediated on this slide. And the others still have we have work to do, whether it be more testing or some remediation. And the status of these sites are updated in a spreadsheet on the town website. In my December 17th newsletter, I notified residents that over the school winter break, work at 4 sites would be performed, including the soccer field at Dwight Elementary School, a field at River Field, soccer fields at Burr Elementary, and the one at Town Hall. The soil removal at these sites involves a small spot removal for areas where the samples exceeded the regulatory standard. These locations do not pose a threat to the public health or our community, and in some cases could have been left in place with a grass monitoring plan. However, we elected to remove the soil in those areas. The work was completed while schools were closed and under the guidance of the town's licensed environmental professional. According to our health director, Sans Clary, while each fill use site has its own unique attributes, at sites where testing indicated concerns regarding exposure risk, Connecticut Department of Public Health was consulted and steps were taken to cordon off areas with fencing, barriers preventing access to eliminate the exposure risk. As you saw on the previous slide, most sites have had the remediation completed or the materials used were determined to be clean fill and allowed to stay in place. The remaining sites are comprised of locations including those with exceedances that are inaccessible because of site conditions, locations with exceedances that don't exceed a direct exposure criteria, but have been remediated based on environmental criteria, locations with exceedances that don't present a public health risk and could be left in place with monitoring conditions. However, the town is electing to remove specific sample locations to eliminate the need for ongoing monitoring. And this slide is just to give some history. New Penfield Pavilion was completed in the summer of 2011, costing the town almost $5 million, and was a year old when it was destroyed by Hurricane Sandy. In 2016, FEMA determined the town would be eligible for $4.3 million in reimbursement towards reconstruction of Penfield Pavilion. Later that year, FEMA put a hold on the reimbursement and warned the town to consider halting construction, as such work could comprise future eligibility in a letter in August of 2016. In March of 2017, the pavilion was reopened, which cost over $7.3 million. In 2018, FEMA deemed the project ineligible for reimbursement. The town appealed in 2019, and in June of 2019, FEMA denied that first appeal. In June of 2021, FEMA reinstated the NOV, denying the appeal, and notified the town then that Penfield would need to be fixed at the foundation. According to FEMA, the pavilion does not comply with floodplain management regulations and has horizontal grade beams above the natural grade and below the base of flood elevation. The town is currently in negotiations with FEMA to resolve outstanding violations. And residents will have an opportunity to weigh in on those options of Penfield Pavilion as we get closer to providing some options we believe are viable. This next slide is Julian fill, and how does it work its way with Penfield for those newer elected officials or maybe residents who aren't aware. So significant amounts of Julian fill was used under Penfield Pavilion and in the parking lot. The site has been subject to testing and remediation requirements in the consent order. Initial soil and air testing was conducted to ensure the safety of our public, to ensure that people could be out around it or in the building. Additional testing is in progress to comply with the consent order. I wanted to update our elected officials and members of our community regarding the WPCA project. So in September of 2020, an NOV was received on the wastewater treatment plant, resulting from multiple PCB discoveries during the hardening project, which was undertaken to better protect the treatment plant from coastal flooding from large storms and sea level rise. The site is not Julian fill, but it is located at the old Nike site where my father actually served when he was in the Army, with historical contaminants. So investigation proposal is being prepared by an LEP to be submitted to the regulatory agency. So I just wanted to note that because it is separate from the Julian fill, but it is a liability to our town, and I thought it'd be important to note it tonight regarding contaminants that we and NOVs that we are dealing with. I thought this would be important for our most notably our elected officials and our community to see the funding and expenditures. So we have here our operating budget from 9/1/16 to 6/31/19, and we provided Exhibit A, B, C, and D in the backup, and it's also posted on our website. So there it shows you what was appropriated and expended from that time period. The surplus transfers, you see the figures there, and expended, and then encumbered, and what's available. And if you recall, we had asked for that surplus money to be held over because we obviously have been in multiple meetings over the last 2 years, and we saw the mounting costs coming, and so we wanted the town to be prepared and thought it was prudent to recommend that the Board of Finance put that surplus money aside for this situation. Town bonding, to date, you see the numbers there, and the WPCA bonding, and that which we consider other contaminants, and that's where we are yet. We still have some information to receive on that site. So Jackie created a pie chart just to kind of give everyone a sense. Expenditures by category. DPW audit is there, 35,000, and then you see the legal fees that associated with this situation, pretty large number. But we need our lawyers, and I do want to take the time to recognize Attorney Miller, that he has been extraordinarily helpful in this process. This is, as you can tell from his presentation slides, he is extraordinarily knowledgeable in this area, and it's been very, very helpful to our town in getting through this situation. The environmental investigations, you see that pie chart, equipment rental, and then labor, and then remediation to date. Projected costs. So we've heard a lot. Elected officials have asked me repeatedly, even residents have said, how much do you think this is going to be? And unfortunately, we've only been able to give estimates because, as you can tell, we are still in these, back and forth with the regulatory agencies, and we don't have these final numbers yet. But we wanted to give such a range, and Mr. Bremer sat for a long, long time with all the LEPs and with Mr. Miller and the regulatory agencies, trying to get an idea of where we might be. So they were looking at the low, mid, and high Penfield remediation. So on the low, 3 million, mid 4, high 5. And obviously these are just guesstimates based on information received in these meetings. Fill pile remediation, same thing, low 4, mid 6, could go to 8. Other sites remediation, 3, 4, 5. And remediation of the parking lot, we're at a low 2, mid 2.5, potentially 3. And again, these numbers are fluid. We don't completely know. We want to give elected officials in our community kind of an idea of what we're looking at. And believe me, I pray that it's lower. Total remediation, low 12, mid 16.5, high 21. And then Penfield construction, we are, we're looking at different, we're in negotiations with FEMA, trying to get a sense of what they will accept from us. And we don't know that yet. We don't know the answers to those questions yet. So it's a lot of back and forth and a lot of meetings, and we're hoping to have some tangible options to be able, that I can present to our community and get feedback from our community with numbers for, A, B, and C. What does the community want to do? And obviously the costs will be very important in that process. There's no estimates included for the WPCA, as the extent of the remediation is still unknown. A RAP is being developed, and after testing is completed, we'll be able to have a better estimate of that cost. And estimates from DEEP, some of these meetings, I mean, they were ranging from, like we showed you here, to, an ungodly number of like $100 million. So these are just discussions, about capping, the fill pile or having to remove. So there's a lot of discussions going on, but that would be the worst case scenario. Our next slide. So in summary, you know, the safety of our residents is the most important priority and paramount to me and my administration. All work at the Julian fill sites require approvals from DEEP and EPA every single step of the way. It's a fluid and ongoing process. And then this is a slide Jackie just created to help people follow along a little better. I know we have a lot of new elected officials, but also the public who may either tune in this evening or look at it another time, just kind of giving, you know, everybody sort of a historical perspective of how this whole thing moved through the time period. And with that, I will conclude the presentation, and Jackie's going to give me, here. Thank you. Okay, I just want to thank everyone, and our first question is from RTM member Sharon Pistilli. Sharon, go ahead.
Hi, Madam First Selectwoman. Thanks for the presentation.
Sure.
I had one question, and this might end up for Bucky, I'm not sure. But I saw Ronald Drive on the list. Was that a curb project?
Yes, it was.
Because I think maybe my street was done at the same time. So I don't know if there's a record of like what streets were done at the same time as Ronald.
So what I'll do is I'll follow up with you. I know we are close. We live close to each other, so I'm aware of where you're talking about, and I will check. But though, right to date, Sharon, we don't have. We did extensive, you know, background research on these sites, from invoices, emails, everything that was used, any projects were, you know, anything that where Julian fill could have been used in any way, shape, form was identified, but I will double check for you.
Yeah, and I'll double check too. Like I asked around with my neighbors just to confirm the year of the curbs, and we've all been here so long we can't remember. So I'll try to see if I can figure it out as well. But I know that there were a whole bunch of curb projects like right in our neighborhood in that timeline. So that was my only
I know.
like
Well, there was
question and concern.
the sidewalk was put in along Burroughs, but Ronald's was a different project.
Yeah, the curbs were long, like a few years after the sidewalk, and when the curbs were put in, there were a bunch of curb projects in the neighborhood going on at the same time. So that was just my only like question or comment on that. And then I had one other question regarding the Nike site.
Yep.
Is there any chance the federal government's going to help us with this?
Mr. Bremer is kind of shaking his head over there. I don't think so, but obviously we're going to be looking at all avenues. We have been looking at all avenues for every single thing we're facing, trying to figure out ways to minimize the cost.
But, and that would be because that was like a federal, like a military site, right? So the contamination would have been left behind by a military activity?
I don't know that yet. Do you want to? Sure, Mike Miller's going to speak.
Hi, this is Mike Miller. So good point, and for sure all avenues will be pursued, but to the extent there are responsible parties for which funding can be attributed, including the federal government. I think it's a little too early to determine whether or not the federal government is in fact a source of the contamination. Certainly the Nike site itself, understanding the operations, tie and bond, and the town's LEPs are evaluating the historical uses of that property now, in fact. But very good point and question.
Great, thank you. That's it. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sharon. Mr. Kuhn?
Thanks, John Kuhn, District 7. Thank you for this. This is for somebody new to the RTN. This has been very helpful. I was just sort of curious about this expenditures chart. And I was first focused on the legal fees. I know the lawyers are expensive. And I guess I'm sort of curious what has gone into the legal fees. And should we expect this to start looking more like a larger share of remediation? In other words, have we largely completed the investigation? Obviously, as we do remediation, we may have to do more investigation if we uncover more things. But as we sit today, are we looking at remediation kind of being the mainstay of the expenditures going forward? And I would hope the bulk of a large percentage of legal fees are behind us, but I realize lawyers are always willing to put their hands out for more fees. So.
Well, actually, I would say we'd be in a whole lot of trouble if we didn't have these lawyers, to be perfectly honest. And it's not just Mr. Miller. There's other attorneys who are involved in this. So no, they are very involved in helping us negotiate these NOVs that are complicated.
Of course,
and very complicated. And we're lucky that Attorney Miller actually has this background and understands these issues. But once these are signed off and EPA and DEP sign off on these sites, I can guarantee you those costs will far exceed the legal costs that we have incurred to date.
The remediation.
Yes, based on the information that I provided on the estimates. But Attorney Miller, would you like to comment?
Sure. I didn't put the chart together, but I'll comment. The number is not just my firm's fees with respect to the consent order and negotiating with the regulatory agencies. So in addition, there are, which we can't comment on, there's ongoing litigation, civil litigation relating to the fill pile itself. There was a federal action that I brought on behalf of the town and favorably settled on behalf of the town last year. I'm assuming those fees are also wrapped up in there, but the settlement amount that was negotiated, $225,000 against an entity that illegally polluted at the fill pile, was also received by the town on that front. There's another law firm handling arbitration against Julian Enterprises. And again, I don't have the chart, but I just wanted to break down for you that those legal fees do not just relate to negotiation of the consent order or addressing those NOVs. There's multiple litigation matters and regulatory matters involved in that. It's a good question.
And is there a possibility of seeing, obviously can't comment on any of the lawsuit aspects, but is there any insurance that we can recapture anywhere, or because of the nature of this, are we not covered?
So I'll have to defer that response to the town attorney, Mr. Baldwin. I know he evaluated that. I don't have the conclusion, but I'm not aware of insurance coverage that would backstop this obligation.
Or any portion. Okay. Thank you.
Attorney Baldwin, would you like to try to respond?
Yes, I'll try. The town early on into the discovery of the Julian fill pile debacle did look to our insurance companies for coverage, and there were exclusions that prohibited us from making any recovery. So that the door was shut on that. There is, however, a chance that we may recover under a crime policy, which is currently being put together in terms of a claim, but that is yet to be submitted to our crime policy carrier. I wouldn't, well, I think I should leave it at that.
And I assume the Julian side is probably not going to yield much for us, or maybe that's litigation that can't be commented on.
I think your latter statement is accurate. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And our next official who wants to ask a question is Sheila Marmion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions on Penfield Pavilion. You gave an overview of the building's history and noted that FEMA denied our appeal and notified the town that Penfield will need to be fixed at the foundation. My question is, are we obligated, since the appeal was denied, to comply with the regulations from FEMA? And if we do not, what are we subject to as a town? Fines, legal action, etc.?
So some of the issues that were brought up during these negotiations, and again, we are continuing to negotiate with FEMA. Mr. Bremer is leading that. One thing was mentioned that if we have a FEMA, a building that's not compliant with FEMA standards on where it is right now, we could put at risk every single homeowner who currently has FEMA insurance there, because FEMA said they could potentially revoke everyone's insurance, flood insurance in that area. So that's obviously a huge thing that was discussed. And so there's multiple issues that have come up during these discussions.
Okay, so that's one thing. Would there also be fines against the town that you know of, Ms. Kupchak?
It could potentially be, but I feel I would be, if I were a resident living in that flood area and FEMA was suggesting they may pull everybody's flood insurance, that obviously would be a huge hit to a number of our homeowners who need that insurance.
Okay, my second question has to do with the fill pile that was used underneath Penfield. I'm assuming that the options that you'll put forward to the town as regards Penfield will explain how we get to, or how you're proposing to get to that fill pile to remove it. Is that correct?
Right. So the licensed environmental professionals have been continuing to test based on the notice of violations and consent orders, and once they have enough information and submit to DEEP and regulatory agencies, then when they come back and they'll tell us, you know, this is what you need to do, we'll do it.
Thank you. And then in terms of the parking lot, it's my understanding there are PCBs underneath the paved parking lot, and we're being told that we need to go and get them out of this sealed parking lot. Is that correct? Are we obligated to go in underneath a sealed lot like this?
So my understanding is that there's nothing being told to us yet what is going to be required. Again, we are in the testing phase and continuing testing phase, and the licensed environmental professionals present information as they go back and forth with DEEP. I don't know if it's only under, if it's under and around. I don't have that level of detail. My understanding is they drill boring holes all over the place, in, around, the perimeter, all of that. So again, this isn't a case of Brenda or anybody gets to decide how this is going to go. This is the regulatory agencies ask our LEPs to perform specific tasks and tests and this and that, and then they give it to them, and ultimately it will be up to the regulatory agencies what will be required of the town to do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next official is Mr. Flynn. Tom? Can't, are you still on? Tom?
Yeah, Brenda, sorry. My apologies. And I said some nice things too to start. I wanted to say thank you for all the time and effort to you and the administration for putting the presentation together. Very much appreciated. I had like 3 questions. My first one was on Penfield itself. I just want to confirm my understanding. In terms of the FEMA decision on our eligibility for the reimbursement, that's done off the table. We're not getting that. Is that correct?
Correct.
So now what we would be negotiating with them, I would assume, is what is an acceptable remediation on our part for the issues we have with that building from a FEMA perspective, not from a deep perspective, but what they believe we need to do with that building in order to bring it into compliance to deal with all the insurance issues and everything else. Is that correct?
So that's right. We're in negotiation with them to determine
Right.
what will be required.
Right. So when it comes to Penfield Pavilion, I guess my point is we have to negotiate with FEMA in terms of the building issues, the issues with the construct of the building, which the fact is that's already cost us $4.3 million. And now we have to come to some resolution with them over how we fix that. And then we're also dealing with the environmental agencies with the remediation of the actual fill pile issue that's also under Penfield and perhaps under that parking lot. Is that the way to understand this?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm glad I just wanted to confirm my understanding. Next, I actually have a question in the presentation itself. On the funding and expenditure slide, if you can refer back to that one, and this is probably for Jared. I was just trying to follow the math on the slide just to make sure I understood it. And in the last column, which is the one that sticks out, the total available is 6.8 million, which that column does not foot. It doesn't add together. So is that a presentation issue or what's the situation there? Just so that we're on the same page.
Jared's looking now.
Okay. And maybe while he's looking to solve that, I think what I heard was on the WPCA, I know we've put a lot of money in a capital plan that we reviewed last week for the WPCA project as we move forward. You alluded to tonight that we don't have a total amount yet for any remediation efforts due to it being an old Nike site. So does that mean that the capital plan does not include costs for any remediation efforts that we're unaware of at the Nike site right now? Is that fair to say?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Then I understood it. And if I could just get an answer to that other question, I'm fine. And again, thank you for all the work and effort that went into the presentation.
Sure.
Mr. Flynn, I can answer your question. The total amount at the bottom is incorrect. It just they didn't add properly. So
Okay.
the numbers for each of the funding sources is correct.
Right. So we have, as opposed to 6.8 million, we have about 7.6 million available under current funding sources, and then we would have to go out for future funding sources, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the clarification. Much appreciated.
Sure.
Thank you. Our next person who wants to ask a question is RTM member Carson.
Thank you. And I really appreciate this presentation and having us all meet to to see all the information. I just have a question about the Penfield Pavilion, the testing that was done. You said there were tests done for, the safety of the air, and that's safe for people to use, I guess, before we even remediate. And can we just get a little bit more information about that so I could just assuage some of my fears that it really is safe? Because how do we know that it's, maybe at that time it was safe, but how do we know things aren't seeping? It's like, back 9/11 when we were told, oh, they could go back and to the site. It was safe. The air quality was safe. People could work on there. And then we know how many people eventually got sick and died and are still sick and dying. So just tell me what kind of testing was really done and what the results were, because all it said was that there was testing done on the air. So what was done exactly? Thank you.
So, thank you. When I came in, and, obviously I was here the first day I came into the job with the notices of violation on the desk unopened that were a couple of weeks old. I immediately, when we went up 2 weeks later, that's when I met Attorney Miller. Attorney Baldwin drove me to Hartford to meet with the regulatory agencies for a very, very long meeting in Hartford. It's deep. We, before the spring season started down at Penfield, I made sure and we ordered all air testing around Penfield, all soil, sand testing around everything to ensure that our community, obviously that had been there for a while, but we wanted to ensure that there was no risk to our community, because obviously if there was, I would have fenced off the whole thing. And so we had the LEPs guiding that whole process, and they have assured me, and I have shared this in my newsletter as well back then, but that it's completely safe to be in Penfield Pavilion and completely safe to be around it as well.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Our next elected official is Mark McDermott.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you for this presentation. I truly appreciate it. I just have a comment or some clarification. First of all, it looks like we've already remediated 27 sites. Is that correct?
I think it might be,
I could have counted wrong, but
quite a few. I could count them off.
Yeah, I think that this is Mike Miller.
Yeah,
the numbering's difficult. Good question. Numbering's difficult, as I indicated in my portion of the presentation. There are sites with multiple locations, so sometimes the numbering refers to locations and not sites. So obviously the location number is greater than the site number. I don't have a count though. I would have to follow up.
So we'll call it 27 sites, and there might be numerous locations on a site, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And we spent so far remediating strictly close to $1.4 million. According to your expenditures chart. So do you feel that these other 11 sites, excluding the Penfield Pavilion, will bring us into that low category of $3 million if you were to look into your crystal ball there?
I left it at home, Mark. Don't have it with me.
You know you should bring it with you to these meetings.
You're right. Honestly, Mark, I know you guys have been asking us at various meetings and stuff, and it's just, I wish I had a hard answer for you. Believe you me, I do.
Okay, I'm hoping it runs. Yeah. I'm sorry for interrupting you. I'm hoping that it runs.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just hoping it runs in that low to less category for those sites to be remediated. And to Mr. Smith's comment about there are multiple locations at a site, could you please clarify, there's some things here that are kind of general, like our favorite topic from the last couple of weeks, Gould Manor. All of Gould Manor is not Julian Philpile issue, correct?
Correct, and I spoke about that during Gould Manor, and also it was extensively laid out in newsletters, quite a few newsletters. I spoke about remediation and specifically Gould Manor.
Okay.
And we all know, most of us who were very intimately involved, but again, put it in the newsletter so our community could know, you know, as that was sort of the first site that was identified for this whole situation. And it was when they put the sidewalk in and they used some of that Julian fill, and that's how this was all sort of determined and uncovered, if you would. But then, and I put this in the newsletter, but just to help with other people, when they were doing the cleanup that was required for that fill, the Julian fill, there's a protocol that's required where they have to dig out a certain amount past where that identified contaminated fill was found, and to make sure that it's not there. But what was happening was every time they were doing that, the LEPs, they were coming up with these high levels of arsenic, which was historical in nature.
Right.
So is it really a huge risk? No, but once you see that you have an exceedance above a standard and you know it, you know, it would have been irresponsible not to clean the hot spots on that site, which then they did a whole grid testing of Gould Manor, and I mean like a grid. And so, you know, there were whatever many areas where there was a really hot spot. And so we felt it was important to clean those spots and make sure it was safe.
Yeah.
100%.
Thank you. Yeah, I just know when we were, you know, knocking on doors back in the fall that there was obviously Gould Manor's in my district, District 7, and there was still some confusion as to what was historical, what was Julian, and it kind of all gets meshed together. And I appreciate you clarifying that for us and the public, because some people, you know, still really don't understand that there's two different things going on there. And I think that's going to be it for me, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next elected official is Liz Zezma.
Thank you, Madam First Selectwoman, and good evening, Liz Zezma, District 4. Brenda, Mark sort of touched on my question, but just to expand it a little bit, if there's going to be a hard delineation between historical and fill pile with respect to expenses, and if the public will be able to see, you know, the side by side, what is the town expending for what you would expect in this part of the country to have some historical contamination discovered, and then what is directly related to the fill pile?
So in this instance, this is the only case I'm aware of all the different associated sites that received Julian fill. This one was the only one that we've expended funds to clean up a historical contaminant.
Gould is the only one to date.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question is, can you remind me, please, what the Stratfield Road contamination is? It's technically a state road, but I don't recall the location or the details.
Property.
It was a single property. They had, I think it was either a tree removed or came down or something of that.
Okay, so
it's just one property owner.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next up is Mr. Stark.
Thanks for taking the question. Could someone, probably one of the lawyers, explain to me what is the connection between repairing or not repairing Penfield Pavilion or getting it into FEMA compliance and insurance rates in the area?
Well, I could answer this to you. So again, we are in negotiation with FEMA. So it does, you know, there's ongoing discussions. Many different things have been brought up, and that was one of them, the potential loss of leaving a building that is not FEMA compliant, especially a large building right next to the water. They're not
Is
very
the
happy
building
about.
gonna come off its foundation and hit other buildings, or I don't understand the risk.
I'm just suggesting, they mentioned that's a potential. There's many others. So what we're doing is we're working on these negotiations with FEMA, trying to get a determination of what they will accept, and then be able to put together a couple of options to be able to present to our community. So what we've done as the town, or I have decided, was to hopefully have those options. We'll be at a point where we'll be able to have some options based on feedback from FEMA that will result from these negotiations. We have stopped, we put a stop to accepting event registrations at Penfield. The last ones will happen in the late October of 2022, which is very unfortunate because it's obviously a nice venue and it's a revenue generator for our town. But we were hoping that at least by then, we'd have some information and the options to present prior so that we would be able to put whatever option that the community chooses that's okayed by FEMA. And of course, we still have this contamination thing going on, but we would love to be able to hit the ground running and have everything completed, whatever that ends up being with Penfield. We still have the contaminated soil, so that's a whole nother issue, but have it done so that in the spring, we don't have payloaders out there and, you know, soil being moved when our community is trying to enjoy one of the very nice amenities that we do have in town.
I appreciate all that, but I mean, this could come up for bonding, and I'm trying to figure out if FEMA is just using this to get leverage over you, and wonder whether we're just bending over and taking this, or whether we should be standing up to them and to DEEP and say, the building stays as it is. Because we're not getting anything back from them, from what I can see. We're gonna spend money renovating a building for the third time for no good reason. So
okay, so
when this comes time for bonding, how about we get the lawyers to evaluate for us on the Board of Finance and the RTM? What is the actual risk if you were to litigate?
So,
how worried would you be about losing that litigation and having insurance rates go up in that area? Okay, that's my request.
Okay, Mr. Stark, I don't really like that language being used at a town meeting. Some of that language is a little inappropriate, if you wouldn't mind. However, again, the town has attorneys. We are, as an administration, in discussion with FEMA, and when we have some information from them, we will then put together some options that align with the law, because FEMA is a federal agency. And once we have that information, we can then put together some potential plans, and those could be knock down the building, move the building, or fix the building. We still have the problem of contaminated soil under the building, which would require us to move it or something to get under the building because it is an extensive amount of contaminated soil that potentially needs to be removed. So we are doing our best. We are following the law. We have lawyers who are helping us in this area. And once we have those options, and I have community feedback on buy-in for whatever option we deem is appropriate and something we can afford, that's when you will see something come before you, but not until then. All right, our next speaker is Representative Iacono.
Thank you, Madam First Selectwoman, Pamela Iacono, District 8. A couple of things, a couple of comments, a couple of questions. Personally, I'd hate to leave a building in place that could potentially flood out neighbors. Maybe that's what FEMA's concern is. So thank you for exhausting all of those different options. Along the lines of Penfield, is there an investigation into what went wrong there? The guidance we got, the advice we got, and the things that happened there. Twofold: one, to make sure that that certainly doesn't ever happen again, and two, any possible legal recourse to recouping any of this, if that can even be commented on at this time.
Well, I'll let Attorney Baldwin speak if he could. I mean, obviously, Pam, there was letters being received by the town saying stop. I don't know why they were ignored. I have no clue. I mean, when we found that letter, I was pretty shocked myself. I have no clue why. I personally wouldn't have ignored that letter. But again, but on the legal piece, Attorney Baldwin, do you have anything?
All that I can add is that it's a very good question, and a thorough investigation is underway, and I'm unable to comment further about the potential for litigation.
Thank you for that. And I just want to close with a comment of share your sentiments that this is so upsetting to watch all this, having watched it all go down and voted on, you know, the Penfield Pavilion reconstruction, and then to see those numbers go there again is so disappointing. Same with what happened with the fill pile, and you know, we just had our waterfall meeting, and it's going to be a lot for all of us to weigh. This is a huge expense that we now have to calculate. That's going to push off other projects as we, you know, examine that waterfall and where we're going to put all this stuff. You know, having to pay for Penfield again, it's actually just sad. So thank you for this presentation. It was incredibly helpful.
Thank you. And, you know, I share your sentiments. Nobody is happy about any of this. And I know no one who's on here tonight is happy about this. This is just a disgrace, honestly. And, but it's something we have to handle. I mean, this isn't the way I intended to start off my first term as first selectwoman. You know, I was hoping to focus on other things, but this is something we have to handle. It's something that's part of our community, and we have to do it. And we're going to do it. We're going to get it done. It's important that we're just cognizant of it, and that's why we put those numbers up during the capital planning, because we wanted all our elected officials to at least have some sense of what we're hearing in these meetings, because we have some significant costs. Even if it's on the low end, it's significant. And it's unfortunate because we do have, as I pointed out, to some people's chagrin, a large capital list of projects. And obviously we're not going to do them all, but wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to do this funding, and we could use that towards the many projects that we have. So I know that the RTM has a committee meeting. We have about 15, oh, we have one more?
Jill Bergara.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jill? Are you on the board?
Hi. Yes, Madam First Selectwoman, can you hear me?
Yes, I certainly can.
Oh, thank you so much for taking this last minute question. I wanted to echo what Representative Iacono said. I'm very disheartened, especially about the Penfield Pavilion. One of the first things that I had actually voted on when I was on the RTM, and it's a very complicated issue, and it raises issues about how it was managed too by the town, by our engineering department, by our building committee. And I'm hoping that we look into all of those issues, because I know that when we voted on it, we had asked about FEMA compliance. It was FEMA compliant, and all of a sudden it had turned into not being FEMA compliant, and the designs were changed. And I'd really like to understand how that happened and whether we can sue the consultants who were involved in that job as well.
So, again, Attorney Baldwin, you know, is looking at all avenues, and I agree with you. I'm not sure how this happened either, and listen, I think it's nice in some instances to have a building committee, but what I've learned over the last 2 years is I believe as a town, when we have major projects, especially something as significant as that, we should have a project manager built into costs so that there is somebody with insurance that has liability and is managing our very large projects, and that we're not relying on appointed building committee people to ensure. But again, Jill, you know, this letter came to the former administration that we should stop building this. I don't know why that wasn't acted upon. So again, I hear you loud and clear, and I don't know if Attorney Baldwin wants to elaborate. I know there's not a lot he can talk about, but if he does have something regarding suits of any kind, Attorney Baldwin?
Let's just say that our possibilities in that regard have not reached a conclusion or an end compared to the chances or the town's efforts to get insurance proceeds from some of our carriers. So there are possibilities there, but I really can't see anything more.
Okay, thank you, Attorney Baldwin.
Thank you, Representative. And we have Mr. Walsh.
Yes, Madam First Select Woman, thank you for tonight. Thank you for being forthright and bringing in all the bodies who need to hear all of this and being transparent and bringing all this stuff up in front of all of us. I really appreciate that. I think you need to continue to do that as we move forward. But just on that last matter we just talked about that Ms. Vergara talked about, and you brought it up once before about the building committees. It might be time, I think, for us to look at this building committee process and whether we need a building committee or whether we go to a professional building committee where we do have insurance that if somebody screws up. There's also a secondary problem with the whole building committee is that we normally put people on these building committees that have an interest for wanting to be on there. And there's been some scope creep on some of the projects that gets built into this thing. And I think having a more, you know, somebody like a project manager instead of a building committee, somebody who's professional, someone who's independent, might be the way to go. Just what we've been finding out over the last 2 years, but also things I've seen over the last 20 years, to be quite honest with you, where things are being put into these projects. They save money in one area and then spend it in another. That was never intended or never presented to any of the boards. So I think it might be time to examine that. I mentioned it during the capital planning meeting, but I think it might be time for all the boards. I know at least I want to explore that on the Board of Finance as well. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Walsh, and I agree with you. You know, obviously you learn things when you're here in this job, and you learn things as well. And I just think it would be just so much more professional on these very large projects to have a professional person who is paying attention. And, you know, I think this will be looked at the Charter Revision Commission as well. Making sure we do have a project manager as opposed to building committees. Because listen, this is huge stuff. These are millions and millions of dollars on schools, on whatever projects the town's overtaking. And, you know, while it's nice to have people who have an interest and want to give back to their community, again, at the end of the day, when something like this happens, we need someone who has liability insurance. And you're right, is sticking to the plan exactly the way it was approved, and that we could go back to for error, you know, if there's a problem, and we say, hey, you got a letter from FEMA, what are you doing? That kind of thing. So duly noted, thank you. All right, well, thank you, everyone, and this will be posted on the town's website. I'm going to include it in the newsletter for our residents. And again, you know, I know it's frustrating to be waiting for information. You want to know what's happening. I'm frustrated too many times because I would like to get moving. I would like to never have to say the words Julian Phil ever again, or Phil Pile, or any of this. But that's just not happening. So we really are doing our best. And as we do get, you know, some of these things signed off on, we put it in the newsletter, we will update, and when I get enough good information, specifically the Phil Pile, which is huge, and Penfield, I will make sure that elected officials know, and we get an update either in this same format or send out information to you by email. So thank you again, everyone. I appreciate everyone taking the time to participate with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brenda. Good night.
All right, good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.